was me with all my frailties because I was the daughter of this man.
From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter, candid conversations with fascinating people. Every family has a secret, but some secrets are much more shocking than others, and some secrets take a lot longer to come out. Angela Hamilton always had an inkling that there was something not quite right about her dad. She really hated him and feared him. He was violent towards his wife and 3 children all through their lives, and he was prone to explosive, racist outbursts. He rarely spoke about his past, but it always seemed like he was running away from something. And it turns out he really was. There's a new SBS series called Every Family Has a Secret, and the makers of the show helped Angela to unearth the brutal truth of hers. Angela joins me now. Angela, tell me about your father's funeral. What happened on that day?
Well, it was in the talk of the preparation of his funeral that discussing with my sister and brother-in-law what the format would be. And I don't know what made me say it, but I said to my sister, if you stand up and say nice things about Dad, I'm going to have my say too. And her husband, John, who was the, master of ceremonies, whatever, and, they sort of nodded, okay. And John said, well, how will we know if you want to speak? And I said, just look across and I'll nod. As it turned out, my sister gave a very honest and forthright, well, not eulogy, but anyway, words about my father. And there was nothing that I found offensive in omissions. But for some reason, John looked across at me, that's my sister's husband, and I nodded and I went up there. And I stood up there and I wasn't wanting to malign him, but before the quite small crowd, but was mainly family and a few friends, I said, we all know who this man was. We all know what he was like as a father and a husband. And I just wonder what made him like that. And so it was not exactly the respectful way to talk of somebody who has died, but I just wanted to acknowledge that this man who had died had not been a loving, kind, caring, wholesome support in our lives. So that's how it went on, and I said my piece, and I said the only time I saw a hint of humanity in that man's face was when some music would come on. I think this was the opera of Franz Lehár, The Merry Widow, and the famous tune. And for 1 nanosecond, my father's face would go far away, but it would come back. And that nanosecond was the only glimpse I ever had that made me wonder about another life other than what I had known as his child.
What were your earliest memories of him as a dad?
The earliest memory, I'm sorry to say, is of him beating up Mum and my sister and I beating at his back. He was a very tall and physically powerful man, and he was bent over in a doorway so we couldn't get to Mum to help her. But these little girls, 7 and 8 or 8 and 9, I can't remember what, beating our fists on his back, trying to make him stop. And he turned around in a moment to push us away. And that was the moment that Mum escaped. And that and what happened after is sort of my first ever sort of cognitive memory of my father.
Are all your memories of him marinated in trauma in that same way?
Yeah, absolutely. The fear that I always felt of being in his presence and what he was going to explode at, to hating being with him. And he would go to the beach in the summertime on a weekend afternoon, and I would go and pretend to sleep because otherwise I would have to go. So I would just go and lie on the bed and pretend to sleep because I couldn't say no. And that personally says a lot to me about how I had, that was my only way of devising some power to not go with him because I simply did not want to be with him.
Was he violent towards you and your sister as well?
One could say his punishment was, many might say, well, look, that was the punishment of the era. But yeah, he'd have no problem caning us or hitting us or kicking us in the backside for how many days a bit of paper had been on the in the driveway, and then punishing us in a form of power where you'd kneel in the corner for 2 hours and then write 500 lines. I must remember to open the gate.
Yeah, I don't know if that was the punishment of the era. That sounds particularly cruel and brutal.
Well, it was particularly brutal when he languished in his power, when I would present that 500 lines, all neatly written, of course, to the last full stop. And he would sit back and he would take minutes before you were finally let off, that's punishment enough now. All right, don't do it again.
Would he ever show you any love?
No. With him, I didn't want his love because he was such a cruel and horrid man. I'd watched what he did to Mum and I knew how we all lived in fear and I really didn't want any association with this man except that was forced upon me as his forcefully obedient daughter.
Did your mum ever talk to you about it?
No. Mum suffered what she suffered and Mum was Scottish and I think it's very much part of the national character that you hold it in and you say nothing and you don't complain, and that was very much Mum's way. But I think it was also for us, and it's a great tribute to Mum, that she, by not saying anything about our father, she didn't extend the punishment, she didn't try to qualify the punishment, she didn't try to relieve the punishment. She just never said a word. It was more onwards and upwards,
Stiff upper lip.
Stiff upper lip, but also resilience. Resilience, come on,
At the time that he died, how old was he and how old were you, and what state was your relationship in by then?
He was nearly 90 when he died, and I was 51. And I stopped seeing him on more than perhaps 2 occasions a year because even into the last days of his life, he could still make me crumble. He just had this psychopathic capacity to break you down and hurt you.
What would he do in those later years as an old man?
I can't tell you. That's the amazing thing. Even my brother used to go to him obediently and loyally to take fish and chips to have with his father in his old years. And one day my brother rang crying. Now, my brother was a man in his 40s. He could absolutely crush you. And I could not repeat. It was so crushing, whatever it was that he would say, it was unbearable.
Did your mother ever get away?
No, Mum didn't get away because it's quite a revelation and quite horrifying to think that it wasn't until the 70s that there was any welfare available to women in situations like my mother was. And we didn't know that as children, so I remember leaning against the kitchen cupboard saying, Mum, leave him. Why don't you leave him? And I didn't understand why. And she didn't say, maybe she did say, how can I? But I never understood fully till much later. There was absolutely no option to leave financially.
If she had no financial independence.
She had no financial
support.
independence, and all what was left of her family were in Scotland, a little village in Scotland.
So what happened after the funeral?
Well, the funeral for me was the last ceremony about him. I was glad to have had my say, whether anybody or nobody heard it. Somehow it was meaningful for me to say, to actually express that I was not lamenting the soul who was going to go to his grave. Life went on, just life went on. When I heard of my father dying, when my sister told me, I just felt release and relief.
Was there some sadness? I've often heard with people who have very troubled relationships with their parents, when a parent dies, there's often a really unexpected level of grief because it's like, well, that relationship can never be repaired. And there's not a sense that you want repair, but there's always a child in you that dreams that one day they will just tell you they love you or be proud of you or will be the parent that you always hoped that they would and who always disappointed you. Did you feel any of that lost hope or that grief?
No, I didn't, because I reviled him as much as I did. But also a very good doctor who I had been seeing at the time did me an enormous service. He was a Sikh and a very spiritual man, and he knew my story, and he suggested that it would be really valuable for me to go and see my father just once more. My father was then in a nursing home, just once more, and to go through a ritual, a symbolic ritual in my own mind of severing my father's power over me. He said to me, because if you don't do this, your father may well trouble you more in death, much as you're saying, than he did in his lifetime. And there was no greater impetus for me to go and do that with my father.
Wow. So it was like the spiritual cutting of the ties, I guess, the hold that he had over you.
Yeah, which seemed to be, it didn't matter whether I saw him once a year, twice a year, or 6 times a year. His power was always there and crushing to the point of almost breaking you. You know, you almost felt that I was living life trying not to be broken.
When did you start becoming more curious and decide to do something about finding out what made him the monster that he was?
I think I was always curious because of the fact we didn't know anything. So as soon as you don't know anything, you know, what filled that space? So there were a few things. One, his own personal violence, his rabid anti-Semitism.
How did that manifest?
Well, you couldn't turn a page in a newspaper or walk past a Jewish person in the street without my father cursing. And he would also, if we were watching TV and a Jewish person came on the screen, he would catapult out of his chair and shake his fist at the screen in violent anger.
Wow.
And curse the Jewish person who was on the screen.
Did he ever extrapolate it about what that was for or what it was that he found so enraging about Jewish people?
No, he didn't. And there was an implicit thing with him that you never asked questions. You never queried him. You never questioned his word. You never doubted his word. But the flip side too was to ask a question would mean that you'd have to listen to him. And he had a loud, commanding, threatening voice. So that's just the way it was. We didn't ask questions. But it certainly was very curious to me that he had this rabid hatred and a seemingly questionable German association in the war.
What did you know about that?
Well, in the early days, all we knew, or probably in our teens we only knew, there was a photo, a black and white photo, which my father felt able to parade, of him. It was quite a large one too, in civilian clothes in front of a Messerschmitt fighter aeroplane, which is the fighter aeroplane of the German Luftwaffe.
Nazis.
So, you know, that was kind of, in a way, a metaphor for how I can do and say and show and do what I want to, but don't you ask me any questions.
He came to Australia as a refugee after the Second World War?
Yeah.
From Hungary?
Well, from Hungary, his last sort of place that he lived in was Austria when he got his refugee status. But those last 2 years of him driving before he got refugee status was him driving around the alpine towns of Austria and Switzerland on the run from the Romanian and Hungarian authorities.
So what did you find out? What was his story?
So we knew as kids, he'd sort of fleetingly mentioned his wife visited him in jail.
So he'd been married before, your mum?
Yes.
And you knew that?
Well, no, actually, in the last year of his life, last few years before he went to the nursing home, and there was a picture of a portrait photo of a lady on the wall, and I must have been emboldened by his late stage of life or something, but I said, "Oh, who is this lady?" That was his second wife. And I said, "How many wives did you have?" Because Mum, we would say, is our third. He said 4.
4 wives?
As it turned out, the third he didn't marry, but that was a real proper relationship.
And your mum was the last?
Mum was the last.
So who were these other women?
My father was quite the philanderer.
He was very handsome looking, tall and handsome.
Yeah, and unbelievably charming. He could charm, well, I won't use the...
He could charm the pants off anyone?
Yeah. But what was really interesting...
How did you know that though? Because did you ever see that? I mean, obviously not projected within your family, but did you see him be charming to other people outside the family?
We saw him. He always looked so confident and debonair. And he would take a lady's hand and he would kiss the back of her hand with his eyes staring into hers, and he would click his heels.
Oh.
And the ladies would just about melt there and then. You could just see it. Yeah.
Wow.
He was incredibly like that.
So the woman on the wall was his... one of his wives?
Second wife, Cotty. But the first wife, who is more interesting because of the fact that through going through my father's papers many years later, we didn't know much about her except that she had been mentioned as my wife who visited me in jail. No more, no less. And it was when I was going through his papers in the last 5 or so years, I found this poor lady's death certificate. But what made this death certificate really pique my interest was she died aged 29, died of a weak heart in the year 1943, but the clanger was she was Jewish.
Ooh.
Yeah.
She was Jewish.
She was Jewish.
During the Second World War,
Yeah.
she died at a surprisingly young age.
Yeah.
Of a mysterious ailment that was diagnosed as a weak heart.
Yeah.
That's intriguing.
Well, that's what I thought. I felt that same way as soon as I saw it, and I kept on rereading the names because they're so flew in the face of my father's anti-Semitism. But these names were typical Jewish names, just absolutely typical. And so I straight away got onto Jewish Gen Online on Google and spent nearly 2 days looking because of the Jewish names, how they have different names and all this sort of thing. And then I found it. I found her burial record, which detailed, amongst other things, the name of her spouse. And there was my father's name, Roshi Pal.
Did you know why he'd been in prison?
I learnt in the process of looking through those same papers that he was effectively a nationalist. North of Hungary became Romania after the First World War, but Hungary wanted it back. The Hungarians living in Romania felt like Hungarians, but they were supposed to be Romanians. So as somebody said, it was the peace to end all peace, this dividing up of countries. So my father was involved in, you might call it, a nationalistic group who were translated to me as the Ragged Guard, who worked to get these lands that were formerly Hungary, now Romania, back to Hungary. And that plot was discovered. So he was jailed for effectively treason. But as children, when he would talk to us about being in jail, it was in a very cavalier way. So it was dismissive. So my personal impression was that it wasn't very important. He, hadn't been a really bad man, or maybe even the authorities had got it wrong. It was just something minor to be got over because there didn't seem to be any great legacy.
What did you discover when you went back and visited that prison and looked at the records?
I was really overcome to learn at this ghastly prison, which was regarded as the Bastille of Romania for its notoriety of how cruelly the prisoners were treated. I learnt of how my father had been tortured, and he was tortured brutally in a truly every sense of the medieval way. His fingers were clipped by pliers. He was beaten by iron rods on his shins and his forearms. He was put in stocks and stretchers.
Stretched, like in some medieval torture chamber.
Yeah. And he also had the must have been terrifying experience where they were shooting machine guns and guns off at his ear and at him. So he didn't know that at any moment he could have died. So I learnt that sitting in the ruin of this incredibly insidious place, and I was really touched and overcome at perceiving my father as human and also suffering. And that was the first time in my entire life I had ever had that perception of my father.
How could you synthesise that?
Well,
with what you knew
exactly,
of him and what you'd experienced.
Exactly. It was very, very confronting. I really didn't know where to put that. My first reaction was to say, well, why didn't you tell us? You know, why wouldn't you tell your kids this so that we, for whatever else we didn't see, that at least we saw that, or at least we knew that? That was my first question in my head. But I think my father did anything to flee from being vulnerable. He never showed a vulnerable side. And if you look through all his papers and photographs and all his stories, the one characteristic which runs through them all, he was always triumphant, always the winner, always the best dressed, always the last one standing, always the one who broke other women's hearts.
Oh, he sounds like Donald Trump.
Let me think about that.
Well, that idea of it has to be, or I mean, it's ultimate narcissism, isn't it? Like
yes.
Psychopathic narcissism.
Oh, absolutely.
That you always have to be the hero of every story and the best there ever was and the most, superlative in every sense.
So there was never any story that revealed a vulnerability or a failing.
Mm. What happened to him after prison? So he was married at the time.
He was married at the time to Rosie, his Jewish wife. He came out of jail because he was released by virtue of a political situation, which was the Hungary that he was trying to win back, was now won back with Germany's help, and was now Hungary again. So that means rest his case. Hungary was now Hungary, so he could be released because his crime no longer applied. So he was released in 1940 and lauded as a hero in his birthplace, I think because of his political nationalistic work, and also perhaps as a martyr because of his suffering under torture. And he was rewarded very, very quickly with a high-ranking position. Now, there again, in the stories he'd told us, he was rewarded with a high-ranking position, which only leaves you full of admiration of it, and that was all we knew. I since learned through various events and information that the high-ranking position he was awarded was in the role of Sorgebüro, which was like a magistrate position, which in 1941, when he was awarded that position, was to carry out the rounding up and the extermination of Jews.
Oh, wow.
While he is actually still married to a Jew.
How does that work?
Well, it sort of didn't. I noticed that my father's wife, Rosie, was not in a Christmas photograph 3 months after he was freed. And I noticed that and I thought, okay, one question, is she taking the photo?
Huh.
But it didn't really rest with me because there were no further photos of Rosie. In fact, in very short time, he's now in Borja, where he's a Sorgebüro, and he's got another lady who's got photos of and who's sending him, photos with nice words on the back of them. So clearly he and Rosie, well, Rosie is still in Siget, my father is in Borsel, which is about 100 k's or so away. Clearly they're separated, but that's all we know. That's 1941.
So what would Rosie's fate have been during World War II?
As was to happen to her mother and father and 2 sisters, they were all rounded up in Siget, in the town of Siget, and sent to the gas chambers. Only one survived. One sister survived. So basically, yeah, Rosie died. However, she died, his wife died in 1943. By April and May of 1944, there were no Jews left in Siget. They'd all been sent to the gas chambers.
And he was working in a different part of Hungary, helping to round up and exterminate Jews in mass killings in concentration camps.
Yes, in fact, though, the method of killing there was rather cruel because Borsel wasn't close to a railway line. So the powers that be, the way they used to operate, there's Olga bureaus that were employed at this time to help deal with the extermination of the Jews. So they would round them up in groups of about 30 to 35 families, women, children, and with no baggage or anything, they were rounded up just in what they were wearing in the local town hall, and they were marched by the gendarmerie up into the mountains, and they were escorted up high enough into the mountains where the snow was deep enough for them to have no hope of return, but where they would all slowly watch each other die, and then to be eaten by wild animals.
And your father oversaw that?
He was involved in overseeing that, yeah.
Angela, how... Like, a lot of people might think that their parents who were abusive were monsters, but your father actually was a monster and committed some of the most heinous atrocities, or was part of a regime that committed heinous atrocities and some of the worst that the world has ever seen. Is there a vindication in that for you, or is it worse? Like, you know, is it, I wasn't imagining the fact that he was a cold-hearted, evil man, and here's the proof.
Yeah, it was sort of maybe in my deepest, innermost self, I sought to find something that related to the man I knew he was. Whatever it was, nothing would have shocked me. I mean, of course it was shocking, but but in fact, to learn it in the circumstances that I learned, it was crushing, and I felt overcome with shame, which I so defiantly wanted to kick back and kick away, but it, you know, I really felt it. And I had to and did work on, you know, sort of rationalising that this was not my shame, it was part of his shame, and it did, you know, it did sit so well with the man I knew. That was it. You know, was I surprised? No. Was I surprised to hear the horrid details, especially when he was actually convicted of a war criminal, of a Nazi and a war criminal, because in the early days, which was only a few months after he was released from jail, so this was very early days in the part of certainly Hungary rounding up Jews. In 1941, on the 30th of April, and I know it was the 30th of April because it was my birthday, this was the early days of this new process. And the Minister of the Interior in Budapest heard about it, and he sent a message through that this be stopped. And the rabbi had indicated that there was a group currently right now being rounded up, ready to be marched up the mountain, and the Minister for the Interior sent the order, stop it. My father ignored that order, and a second order came as this was horrible practice was taking place. A second order came. He sent them to their death. So he could have saved them. And there were whole families, young to elderly. And it's for that reason he was convicted of a war crime and later chased by the Hungarian and Romanian governments. But, the rather ghastly truth is that he was doing this not just on one day, he was doing this for 3 years. Originally in Borja, there were 2,000 Jewish people. By the time he left, his work had been done in 1944, there were no Jews left in Borja.
Oh my God.
And this is the man who hated Jews, who exploded at Jews, but who managed to acquire all their possessions, so all the Jewish people who went off to die, I think amongst the handful of authorities who were in Borja, they all got all their money and valuables.
What was the process of finding this out? How did you find it out?
It was told to me sitting on a beautiful, beautiful mountain alpine country, the, quintessentially idyllic mountain country. I sat beside a Jewish researcher who was very gentle in the telling, and she told me, she pointed out the mountain, the very mountain.
Did you feel like you had to apologise for him? Did you feel responsible for his actions as his daughter?
Yeah, I did. Elena was beautiful and so gentle, so invested in her culture. She was a curator of the local Jewish museum in Sziget, and she was so lovely. And after the filming, the crew had gone down the slopes, and Elena and I just sat there, and I think it was on film, this part. I just felt totally bereft, and I just turned to her and I apologised. That really ended up being such a huge part of the story, which was an opportunity afforded to me, that I could pay tribute to the Jews that had died at my father's hands. I felt I did that, and I wanted to do that as I stood at Rosie's grave. My heart went out to her. I felt such affinity with her. I felt she, like my mother, had paid a huge price for having loved him once, or for him having loved them. I know what I believe. I believe Rosie's death was engineered. It's only conjecture, but it's just too much of a blessing to have come into my father and his parents' lives, and the timing could not have been any different. It absolved my father too, as the gentleman in the Court of Justice, Palace of Justice, told me later, that the death certificate was his divorce. So he was he could waive that. That cleared him of any involvement that might otherwise incriminate him.
When the war ended, how did he find his way to Australia?
Well, he applied to be a refugee. He was on the run, and simply he did all that he needed to do to apply to be a refugee, and I'm not sure why it became Australia, but I did see firsthand his application papers to become a refugee, to go to Australia, and he was not truthful in his application.
Didn't mention the Nazi part.
Didn't mention being a Zorgebüro. During that time, he mentioned that he was working for his father as a lawyer. And to the question, have you ever been found guilty of a criminal offence, he answered no. And before long, he was on the ship to Australia.
Did anyone here ever know that you've been able to find out?
Well, they will now, but no, that was part of the thing that sort of fueled my own intrigue. My father made out that he was a cultured intellectual, which he possibly was. He could quote the classics and opera, etc. He went to a very good university in Romania. But his friends ended up being rogues. Yeah, people he came over on the boat with who did end up having quite good high office positions in Perth were not long friends of my father's. And I would just notice, I used to dance at the Hungarian dance group, which was really just a very communal thing of, let's get all our daughters together and. And my father never used to come and watch, thankfully, because I lived walking distance from the hall, so I could walk, whereas a lot of the other girls had to be driven by their parents, and the mums would sit and embroider costumes and, chat, and the men would chat together. And, it was really noticeable. If my father would come twice in a year, and no more, please, everybody drew in a breath. The whole atmosphere changed, just stiffened. And I noticed that, and again, I couldn't ask why. Nobody was telling me why. It was probably inappropriate for anybody to say anything. It was just another fact of life which fueled this scariness about my father, if you like. And then as I got older, the wonder of, we've heard all the good bits. We've seen photos and postcards of you travelling through Austria and Switzerland with this lovely woman in a convertible car, and you're always amazingly well dressed. We saw you mountaineering with your father and the support crew. We saw you at school dressed up, to the nines, looking like, that you were leader of the pack. What are the gaps? What happened? And, he would mention the second wife, Cotty, but, just nothing. There was these dots, threads, like a sort of Hansel and Gretel, so little drops of rice, a picture, a little bit more, and a picture. But his side was all good stories, and you had to sort of... It didn't
add up.
No.
Do you think, looking back now, that other people of his generation and from similar background suspected and would have known what those gaps meant at that time of a man of his age and stature?
Yeah, I think so. And, his own age group, they would have known. And I don't know whether it was my father's own intimidating manner. He's had such a sort of...
Oh, he was a bully.
He was.
Yeah.
And so nobody's going to say, how are you feeling these days, pal, after what you did? Nobody was going to say that. It was sort of, and that same sort of unspoken, sort of tacit, don't ask me questions, that seemed to apply to his whole milieu. And I don't know whether that's why he ended up surrounded by rogues, because they kind of didn't matter and they wouldn't have known the story anyway.
Did he have family after the war?
His parents were still alive. He was an only child.
So no siblings, no cousins, no...
He had a cousin, yeah.
Any living relatives now?
Possibly on that side, but we don't know about them, yeah.
So what did you do with the information that you had? I guess you had to tell your sister and your brother.
Well, after Romania, it was like an avalanche of huge waves coming over me, because every day something that would cut me to my core. For example, the first one, I think the first thing we did was go to the prison. So that cut me into my core in a way that I really, really didn't expect. I never expected to feel sorry for my father.
Yeah, because I watched you in that part of the episode hearing the information and crying and getting emotional, and I was like, but he was awful. But it's not that simple, is it?
No, and to read it, so you had two senses. You were hearing your voice say it, and it just seemed so visceral and so visual. It really did. And then putting my father into that character and how he would have borne that. They kept on torturing him because they wanted a statement. Now, what was that statement? Was that statement an admission of treason? Because then what was the punishment to treason? And I think you'll find it's death. So, in a way, my father's life depended on him enduring that torture.
And your life in turn, ironically.
I know. We've sort of thought about that. My daughter and I have sort of chatted, and my sister and I have chatted, that To wish justice had been served would be to wish away our very lives. It would have spared our mother misery, but I wouldn't be here, but my children wouldn't be here. So you have to come to terms with it. And that's part of the reason why I love this Every Family Has a Secret story and opportunity, which it really has been, because it does draw the line now for our family. There is no more mystery. There is no more power entwined in that mystery, which was very kind of subliminal in a way. My father was dead, but because we didn't know, there was still a power. And now, because of the journey that I have been taken on, with the benefit of professional researchers who allowed me the opportunity, grueling and haunting as it was, to walk in my father's footsteps, to know and to feel to my soul the truth, and to be able to tell that story through Every Family Has a Secret and interviews like this. This line is now drawn. My father, there is no more mystery. We know all about him.
As bad as it gets.
As bad as it gets. He thought, such was his arrogance, he would have been certain he would have taken that to his grave. He would have been certain of it. And he hasn't. And I speak for myself. I'm enormously liberated by that. You know, there's no mystery, there's no wondering. There is a terrible sadness for my mother. There's a terrible sadness for my brother and sister and for myself. There's even a terrible sadness for my own children, because I was me with all my frailties because I was the daughter of this man.
That's what's made you who you are.
Mm.
The monster that he was has made you the person that you are, which is not a monster.
No, but, you know, I was deeply insecure, deeply needy, but I've done that journey now, and we're all in such a good place because of that truth.
Angela, what do you do with the shame? How have you metabolised that and let that go?
I can't really. I can only be grateful for the separation I have always given myself from my father. I never felt any closeness to him, as you say, you know, in the beginning when you asked, you know, how do I feel about not being loved? I feel grateful that I didn't have to deal with that as another issue. He was just a cruel and brutal monster who was capable of far more than even I expected. But it's his. I have that memory, but if I can convert that shame to tribute and honouring Jews and honouring Rosie, who would be long forgotten, that's what I do with it. They're not forgotten. All those Jews who perished in the most cruelest and awful ways, they're not forgotten. And I do pay tribute, and I had an opportunity to do that in the actual series, to go up to the mountain where a lot of the locals have erected iron crosses, and to walk up into the mountain and to touch the earth and place flowers. And I will continue to honour them.
Angela, just by telling your story, you have... I can't speak on behalf of all Jews, but I am Jewish, and I'm just so enormously touched and grateful that it's not just the people who lost a lot who need to be responsible for making sure that people don't ever forget what happened. It would have been so much easier for you to just pretend that this never happened or to completely divorce yourself from it, but by seeking the truth, you really have given a gift to Jewish people and to everyone who needs to remember what happened in the Holocaust. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mia. I'm deeply touched.
Thanks for listening to No Filter. You can watch Angela's episode of Every Family Has a Secret on SBS On Demand now. Just follow the links in our show notes to find them. And if you're after something else to listen to and the topic of this podcast piqued your interest, check out the No Filter episode I did with Holocaust survivor Eddie Jarku. It's the other side of the coin, I guess, of this story. And it was really moving to interview Eddie and to think about that when I met Angela, and to see the deep grief that she has around the part that her father played in the Holocaust. And it's funny, I could see a real kind of closing of the circle and a sort of a healing in the conversations that she says that she's had with members of the Jewish community, who have been just so loving and supportive of her and comforting her as she's learnt the true horror of who her father was. No Filter is produced by Eliza Ratliff. I'm Mia Friedman, and I'll see you on Mamma Mia.